Hey, a quick note before today's show. As you may know, President Biden and former President Donald Trump are debating Thursday night, tonight. It starts at 9 p.m. Eastern, and you can watch it all live at WashingtonPost.com. This is going to be a pivotal campaign moment. And speaking of, if you listen to the campaign moment, we are recording a late-night episode right after the debate with all the takeaways that you need. Look for that in your podcast feed first thing Friday morning. All right, on to today's show. Back in college, Javier Quiroz and his girlfriend Haley Seifert had a routine. They'd start their days commuting together to campus, to Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee.
I lived a little bit further out than Nashville. He was a little bit closer to the university, so in the morning I would drive to his parents' home where he was, and then we'd get in the car together and I'd drive us to the school and then back.
That was their routine. And Haley would always be the one driving, even though it was Javier's car. It was an old beige Mitsubishi sedan, and he could never be the one in the driver's seat.
I am a big fan of cars and automobiles, and it felt like a cruel joke that I can't even, drive one. Even if I do have a car and I do have car insurance, I'm not supposed to drive it because I don't have a driver's license.
Javier is undocumented, and he couldn't get a driver's license. And driving without one could get him deported.
That's everything that's gone. That's a big problem.
Haley is a U.S. citizen. She says she always knew that Javier wasn't. That when he was just 3 years old, he and his mom left their home in Mexico and crossed the border into the U.S.
But I found out in more detail, of course, when we started dating, and just as we got closer, I was able to be informed of what all that really meant.
What it meant was, despite their commitment to each other, their ability to plan out their lives together in the U.S. was tricky. Until last week, when President Biden announced a fix for many undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens.
For those wives or husbands and their children who have lived in America for a decade or more but are undocumented, this action will allow them to file paperwork for legal status in the United States. Allow them to work while they remain with their families in the United States. Let's be clear.
Up there on the stage, standing next to Biden as he made that announcement, was Javier.
The entire event felt at times surreal. Shaking certain people's hands, felt surreal.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, June 27th. Today, immigration reporter Maria Sacchetti tells us more about Javier and Haley Quiroz and their love story. They are among the more than 500,000 couples whose lives could change because of Biden's executive action last week. But their lives could change back, depending on who becomes the next president. We will also hear about how Trump and Biden differ when it comes to immigration, a theme that is expected to come up during Thursday's presidential debate. So, Maria, before we return to Javier and Haley's story, I want to hear more about what it was like for Javier to grow up undocumented.
So Javier came to the United States when he was 3. He and his mother crossed the border illegally. He has no memory of that crossing. When I interviewed him in 2021 for the first time, he told me that his family had come from a very small, poor town in Mexico, and that they decided to come to the United States in search of a better life. And they started out really poor in Tennessee. Earliest memories are living in a cockroach-infested apartment. They slept on the floor, ate dinner, sitting on plastic buckets. Over time, though, his parents built businesses. They went from cleaning houses and laying bricks to owning their own businesses, and they bought a house. But Javier knew that his life could change at any moment because of their immigration status. He is undocumented, and so he knew, and his mom sat him down at one point and explained what that meant, that life was always going to look different. He wasn't going to get a driver's license.
I wasn't going to be able to go to college. I wasn't going to be able to get financial aid or the scholarships that were supposed to be mine. I'm not going to be able to get them.
Despite all these obstacles and concern about, that he wouldn't have a future in the United States, Javier said his mother kept encouraging him to just keep pushing the boundaries, just to try, even though it seemed like nothing was going to work out for him. And he did end up figuring out a way to go to college. But all along, he just kept asking himself, is this worth it?
It was a crazy idea because I knew that if I graduated undocumentedly and I was not going to be able to work with whatever degree that I graduated with. And at times, I really wanted to just quit and just stop because here we are doing all this work and paying all this money for a degree that essentially was going to be at a very expensive paperweight.
And then one day in 2012, President Barack Obama calls this press conference in the Rose Garden, and he says he's going to create a program called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
This morning, Secretary Napolitano announced new actions my administration will take to mend our nation's immigration policy, to make it more fair, more efficient, and more just, specifically for certain young people, sometimes called dreamers.
And that program transformed hundreds of thousands of lives. It directly affected people like Javier and Javier himself, because it meant that he would get protection from being deported in this country, and he would get a work permit, everything he had dreamed of. And he was, in college at that time, and he remembers watching that scene unfold and just started bawling. He kept saying, my mother was right. Now I'm going to become a nurse. I'm going to, get my driver's license. I'm going to build this life. And he did all of that.
So it sounds like this was a really pivotal moment for them and for a lot of people. Like all these doubts that Javier and Haley had about his future here, that all seemed to change after Obama's announcement. How did it change their relationship?
So the couple decided to get married. And can I just tell you a little bit about why I wanted to talk to both of them?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because so often when immigration reporters interview somebody who is a dreamer, you only hear from one person, the person facing this problem, the immigrant. But the fact is that millions of Americans are related to these folks. They're friends with these folks. They go to school with them. And it always affects them too. And so I was always very curious to know how Haley felt about all this. She's not an immigrant. She doesn't have any recent immigrants in her background. And yet she decided to marry someone who's undocumented, who could be swept out of the country as far as he knew. And they bought a house together. They started a family. They had 2 children. You might hear them in the background of the conversation I had with them. And they really put their faith in each other.
Haley had, at the time, shown commitment to me that despite me being undocumented and despite not having a clear future with being able to work in the degree that I was working for, and like she told you, she was driving me to school, right? And it proved to me that I found the one, because she didn't care if my future was uncertain or whatever. She loved me for who I was at the time.
And so tell me a little bit about why their situation has been complicated.
So to begin, every 2 years, anyone with DACA has to apply to renew their work permit, renew their protection from deportation. That's frustrating for folks.
You want to be excited for the future, but there is uncertainty that comes with it, because every 2 years or even before that, you don't know if it's just going to all go away.
The Republicans under Trump sought to end the program, and that met multiple legal challenges. And a federal judge has already said that DACA is unlawful. So now there's just this big question mark, not just whether they'll get their work permit every 2 years, but whether the program will survive at all. It makes it really hard for Javier and his family to make long-term plans.
When we got our first house, that was going to be kind of the most riskiest thing because like here we have a mortgage, and if something happens, especially during the Trump administration, like if they're successful with removing DACA and they really knock on my door and try to deport me, what are we going to do with the house?
It also makes it hard for Javier to ever consider leaving the country, even just to go on vacation. And I think one of the things that stresses immigrants out is they feel like they have to be on guard against any little mistake. They don't ever want to get into trouble. They don't want that to lead to possible deportation. I mean, even a small traffic stop could lead to them being banished from the country.
We are held to a higher level of standard than any U.S. citizen. Like, we have to be perfect individuals, pay our taxes, work and renew, and work and renew. And, I am grateful for DACA. I don't want to come off like I'm not grateful for it. But it was never meant to be a permanent solution. So it's just kind of dragged on. And, I just can't wait anymore. And I'm tired of waiting, because if I wait any longer, then it opens up the opportunity for the wrong administration to come back and continue to try to remove it. Got lucky last time. I don't know if I'm going to get lucky over and over again.
Did Javier and Haley ever apply for a green card for him? Like, would that have made things easier for them?
So they didn't, and it's a little complicated.
The process is not as simple as most think. So either way, regardless of whether he's married to me, he would still have to go back to Mexico.
Because Javier came into the United States as a child, crossing illegally, over the border, the rule for people in that situation is they have to leave the United States first and then apply to get back in from outside of the country.
And then wait to be told whether they are going to grant him to come back to the U.S. So that was always the huge risk, is if he does go back to Mexico, there's a chance he may not come back.
So for Javier, it seems like a simple thing to just cross the border, ask for permission to return legally. But the fact is, there's no guarantee the U.S. government will say yes. And he might have to wait years to come back in, or he might never have gotten approval to come back in.
And we've even considered, okay, well, if it happens, we'll figure it out. We're nurses. We can work anywhere. We can even work across, right along the border if we have to.
Wow. So this is really counter to my understanding of how the system works. Because my assumption was that, if you get married, even if you're not from the U.S., if you get married to a U.S. citizen, pretty soon you will be able to have things figured out and you'll be able to live here, and that having that marital relationship is it's a green light for being able to stay in the U.S.
Well, and that's what everybody thinks. And partly that's how it is in the movies. It looks so easy. And actually that's what Javier and his wife Haley were talking about is not that easy. And especially if your spouse is undocumented.
And so then take me to this moment last week where President Biden makes a big announcement, and Javier is a part of that.
He was a big part of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Javier Quiroz Castro. My resilient parents brought me to this country to give me a chance at a better future when I was just 3 years old.
He gave a speech about his life experience as a dreamer, about his family, about how DACA changed his life and enabled him to be a nurse and to save lives during COVID.
Saving American lives was only possible because of DACA. It allowed me to live and work and build a family in the only country I have ever known and loved.
And then he introduced the president.
I stand before you today, filled with hope and gratitude, because it is a privilege to personally thank President Biden for delivering on his promise to protect American families like mine.
Maria, can you explain to me exactly what it is that President Biden announced?
So what President Biden did was say that for people who are married to U.S. citizens who are undocumented, who didn't have that first legal entry, they no longer have to leave the country to apply for a green card. And it's just saying, kind of waving a magic wand and saying you're in, as if you had entered legally. I mean, Javier was 3 years old when he first crossed the border, but now he doesn't have to worry about that. They can apply here, they can go through the interviews here, and if he gets approved, then he can get his green card here, and then he'll be on a path to citizenship.
This action is a better way. It doesn't tear families apart while requiring every undocumented spouse to fulfill their obligations under the law.
What was it like for Javier, being in the room for that, standing next to the president as this is being announced?
He said it was surreal to be the center of everything, and also as someone who's the former President Trump denigrated Mexican immigrants. Most of the folks who are likely to benefit from this are going to be longtime immigrants, undocumented, mostly from Mexico, who are often very much overlooked in this whole debate. I mean, they are by far the biggest number of DACA recipients, the biggest number of undocumented immigrants. Not the majority, but the biggest number for sure. And so he felt like he was representing everybody in that moment.
I was nervous for sure, but I was ready because I knew, that I have to stand up there and represent my people. In a way, I'm representing all immigrants, undocumented or not.
After the break, Maria digs into Biden and Trump's records on immigration, their plans, and how those plans could affect families like Javier's. We'll be right back. Why was this a policy that Biden and his administration decided to put in place?
This is something that lawmakers and advocacy groups had called for a long time. They felt it was something that Biden could do in the absence of any action from Congress. And so they had really urged him to do it. He has done a lot to try to crack down on the border, which has been a very big issue in the polls, an issue among Democrats as well as Republicans. And they thought that this was something that Biden could do for people who, in any other circumstance, would have a path to citizenship by now.
And to be clear, this applies to partners, to spouses, and also to stepchildren, correct?
Right. There's an estimated 50,000 stepchildren. So those would be the immigrant children who don't have papers. And they would also be protected under this.
So, Maria, I want to take a second to zoom out here and talk a little bit about the context of this announcement. We are at a moment where we are about to see the first presidential debate of this round between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, in which we imagine they're going to talk about immigration and their plans, their record on immigration. What should people watching the debate know about both candidates when it comes to the immigration issue? And maybe let's start with Biden.
I mean, what's difficult about assessing Joe Biden's immigration platform is there are really, two Joe Bidens. You have the Joe Biden who had his platform in 2020, which is so different on immigration from what it is now. It was the most progressive platform anyone had ever seen. It was a deal he struck with Bernie Sanders and advocacy groups. And there was a lot of optimism, that he would spend a lot of political capital on that there would be a lot of help for immigrants.
Within 100 days, I'm going to send to the United States Congress a pathway to citizenship for over 11 million undocumented people. And all of those so-called dreamers, those DACA kids, they're going to be immediately certified again to be able to stay in this country. People are seeking asylum. They deserve to be heard. That's who we are.
But Biden also said early on that he didn't want 2 million people on the border. And every year, he's at an average of 2 million people on the border. And so Biden's crackdown on the border, his restrictions on asylum, which have gotten tougher and tougher and similar to the Trump administration's restrictions, have gotten him a lot of criticism.
We must face the simple truth. To protect America as a land that welcomes immigrants, we must first secure the border and secure it now.
But Biden has also done something else. He's also letting other people into the United States as long as they apply and have a U.S. sponsor and generally fly in through airports instead of crossing the border, from people from countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And that's what he really wants people to start following. He does not want them to cross the border illegally. He thinks it's dangerous and it requires smuggling. And he says it's much, much better if you come in through in an orderly way. In fact, he just said the other day, he's like, we can do both.
Look, the Statue of Liberty is not some relic of American history. It still stands for who we are. But I also refuse to believe that for us to continue to be America that embraces immigration, we have to give up securing our border. They're false choices. We can both secure the border and provide legal pathways to citizens.
And the other thing that he's been pointing to is the Congressional Budget Office has been publishing reports saying this unexpected influx of new people has been a boon to the economy. The U.S. economy has rebounded more strongly from COVID than any other. And turns out, this influx is helping to fuel that.
So it sounds like here there's a bit of a tension between the different ways that Biden is approaching immigration. That in some ways he's like, quote unquote, cracking down, putting in place policies on the border that a lot of people believe are reminiscent of policies put in place by President Trump in terms of their toughness, but also that he's making announcements like this of another way that he wants to help some groups of immigrants continue to live in the U.S. and like open up these other pathways. I think you could view it from the perspective of Biden just thinks these are good policies, but also, anything that Biden announces right now is also a political play. Can you talk a little bit about that, like what you think the strategy is here of having both the tough crackdown measures and then these very like crowd pleasy, here's a family that we're going to help stay together now with this new policy that I just announced?
There's concern about the Latino community, particularly Mexican and Mexican Americans, coming out to vote. Mexican Americans are by far the largest Latino group in the country. Most are U.S. born. And, the voting power is significant. I mean, you don't have to look any farther than California to see that. California has changed tremendously. Places like Orange County that used to be Republican are now no longer Republican strongholds. And so that is a very big deal. And people were saying, advocacy groups were saying that since this will primarily benefit Mexican immigrants, and one undocumented immigrant could be related to many, many U.S. citizens, they hope Biden's action will persuade people not to sit out this election.
And how did President Trump respond to this announcement that Biden was making the immigration process simpler for this significant group of people?
President Trump considers this and DACA and other programs illegal amnesties. He thinks these are that this should not happen. He's been hard to pin down on some of this because he said during his term that he had a lot of love for dreamers, people like Javier.
Well, I have a great heart for the folks we're talking about, a great love for them. And people think in terms of children, but they're really young adults. I have a love for these people, and hopefully now Congress will be able to help them and do it.
But he also, let his administration try to end DACA. So when it comes to immigration, a second Trump administration could be an even greater crackdown on immigration than even Trump's first term. So, and just some of his proposals include mass deportations of undocumented immigrants in the United States, whether they've lived here for a long time or not.
The first and most urgent action when we win will be the sealing of the border, stopping the invasion, drill, baby, drill.
He's talking about mass deportations, about camps, about really cracking down on the border, not allowing people in.
Isn't Biden already doing that now? That like those last two parts about cracking down on the border and not allowing people in?
Biden expelled more immigrants at the border than Trump did. just because more people were trying to get in. So definitely. Trump has also talked about proposing to tap the military to help him with this effort, putting people into camps, getting rid of birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. But legal scholars say that would be very difficult to do on his own. He has also not ruled out returning to one of the biggest debacles of his term when he separated thousands of parents and children at the border without a plan to reunite them. And those are just some examples of how far a second Trump term could go on immigration. And, he is very likely to face a lot of resistance to this in the courts and also, in communities where immigrants live and people defend them. But there is a history of mass deportations in the United States and policies targeting immigrants, and people are taking these proposals seriously.
Yeah, I can imagine why this would be incredibly concerning. Okay, so if we think about a second Biden presidency, how could immigration and immigration policy look?
The Biden administration is more of a question mark. It's not really clear, partly because Biden hasn't said what he would do with his second term. Would he try to return to his more progressive platform from 2020? We don't know, because he has taken a turn much harder toward the center, and some would say toward, some of the border crackdowns more toward Trump. The Biden administration rejects that comparison, though, because they say they've allowed people in. They've just asked them to do it legally, and hundreds of thousands of people are coming in.
I want to come back to Javier and Haley. This seems like a moment that is bringing some potential hope for them. But as you pointed out, there's still a lot that's up in the air and a lot that's highly dependent on what happens in November and what happens after, and how complicated the factors are here for them. What's on their mind as they look toward the future and as they consider how what's happening in Washington could continue to affect them and their family?
Well, that is, they're going to be watching the debate Thursday night because they want to know if President Trump will try to interfere with what Biden has done for them.
I'm really curious to see what their plans are because immigration is always the biggest topic. So I want to see, especially with this executive order that's come out, what is going to be the rebuttal on Trump's side? How is he going to use that to basically overturn everyone to vote for him?
And they also want to know what President Biden says about his policies, not just on immigration, but that definitely is a big one. I covered it when President Obama announced DACA, and it was shocking to so many people. They couldn't believe that after years and years of waiting, that people would finally be able to get a driver's license, just feel like a regular person, regular part of this country. And it was transforming. But I was also there in 2017 when Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General under the Trump administration at first, announced that they would wind down DACA, that they would end it. And no one ever thought that would happen. And I saw the look of shock and disbelief on these young people's faces that it was really possible. So I don't think anyone is looking at this debate or this election taking anything for granted and assuming that anything is locked down. They have a lot riding on this election.
And I think to your point, it seems frankly, one of the lessons for people like Javier and Haley is things can be given to you and things can be taken away. And the moments that seem so hopeful and celebratory, depending on politics and how things play out, those things are not permanent. And that's part of what's challenging about the situation is that because there's no long-term legislation, all of these things are sort of subject to the whims of who's in charge.
That's exactly right. And even if they're not deported, they still might have to keep fighting and devoting their time when they say they should be raising their children, participating in their community, mowing their lawn, whatever it is. They're just going to have to keep fighting all the time. And that fight has just dragged on for decades.
Maria, thank you so much for sharing your reporting with me.
Thanks for having me.
Maria Sacchetti covers immigration for The Post. Before we go, we've got some news from the Supreme Court. The justices have ruled that, for now, hospitals in Idaho that receive federal funds must allow emergency abortion care to patients. That is, even though the state strictly bans abortion. In anticipation of a ruling on this case, anti-abortion activists have been gathering outside the court this week. If you can't hear, the person on the megaphone is chanting, "ER doctors do not kill." Though the ruling officially came out this morning, it was briefly posted online on the court's website yesterday. A Supreme Court spokeswoman said that early posting was an accident. This ruling was disappointing to anti-abortion activists. Reverend Patrick Mahoney spoke with our producers outside the Supreme Court this morning. He told them that the decision makes it clear what's at stake in the presidential election, and even in tonight's debate.
I hope President Trump makes it clear it's not a political issue, but a human rights issue. I don't think we have any doubt abortion is going to be front and center in Atlanta tonight. And so I hope President Trump clearly articulates his position. And I hope America has a chance to hear the Biden position on abortion, which is extremist.
Abortion rights groups are treating the ruling as a temporary victory. But it doesn't settle the question of whether federal law can preempt strict state bans in other states. And patients who face pregnancy complications are still left in limbo, unsure what kind of care to expect at hospitals in states with strict anti-abortion laws. That's it for today's episode of Post Reports. Thank you so much for listening. And on a lighter note, I need to tell you about something that has completely changed the way that I think about a daily task that, admittedly, I sometimes dread, which is cooking. The newest season of the Post's Try This podcast is out today, and it is a short and sweet audio course about how to get the most out of cooking, how to actually enjoy it, or how to enjoy it more. My friend and colleague Christina Quinn talks to the Post's recipe developers and food writers, plus some other experts, about things like how to find your kitchen personality, how to build a repertoire you can rely on, how to identify the hidden benefits of the cooking process. And the audio course offers a whole bunch of tips and shortcuts to get to mealtime faster. Find a link to the first episode of the course out today in our show notes and at postreports.com, or search Try This from the Washington Post wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky with help from Ali Bianco and Trinity Webster Bass. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thank you also to Dominic Anthony Walsh. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.